Right, we're going to be in Ezekiel tonight. Be finding the book in your Bibles. Good to see you tonight. Hope everybody had a good afternoon. This is one of my favorite books. I guess there's no limit to the number of favorite books, so I guess all the books are my favorite books. But this is way up there because this is one that I didn't really even study at all until later on in life. I didn't really get the chance to teach it until about 2 years ago, and that was a little bit over a year study. So this has been one of the favorite books of mine because of the wonderful information that we find inside. This is just a beautiful book for us to look at. We've studied through Jeremiah, we've studied through Lamentations, and those books are pretty dark books. Because of the situation, because of the sins of Israel and their rebellion against God, God is bringing about this judgment against His people. And there's some glimmers of hope in those books, but for the most part, they're just books full of catastrophe and destruction. Ezekiel is similar, but if you were to look at the whole book of Ezekiel, what you see in the whole is a loving God. Who cares about His people and who wants them to understand what He's doing and why He's doing the things that He's doing in the way that He is. And so we can find tremendous comfort in this book. If you were to look at the book as a whole and try to kind of divide it up, this one's a little bit easier to divide up. In the first 3 chapters, you have the Call of Ezekiel, and then 4 through 23, you have a description of judgments against Jerusalem, understanding why they're being judged. And this section is full of all kinds of images and pictures and signs, and I'm not going to have enough time to go into a lot of detail about all of them, but I do want to try to give you an impression of the nature of that section, because it's just amazing. But then you get to chapter 24, and it transitions into another section where he talks about the judgment against the nations. And then that lasts to chapter 32, where he transitions into the final section from 33 to 48, which is all about the promises of hope for his people. So that's kind of the simple breakdown of the book. You have the fall of Jerusalem is coming, the fall of nations, and the fall of Jerusalem takes place at that time in the second section. And then you have the hope after the destruction of Jerusalem in the book of Ezekiel. So pretty simple layout for the book as we study through it. You just imagine being an Israelite in captivity. You're not in Jerusalem anymore. You've been carried off away from Jerusalem in the second captivity. Daniel was carried out in the first captivity. Ezekiel was carried out in the second captivity. And you can just imagine living there outside of Babylon by the Chebar canal and just waiting for the day when you're allowed to go back home to Jerusalem. Everybody there would be holding out hope for something like that happening. And Ezekiel would probably be one of the ones who would be more hopeful because Ezekiel is a priest. We find that out in the first few verses of the book. And he is 30 years old, which is the time when a priest would typically go into service at the temple. He's been training all his life to be a servant at the temple as the priest. And you can just imagine his longing to go back to Jerusalem and to fulfill his duty and do the things that he's always trained to do. Just imagine being carried off from your home and desiring, as you're in this foreign place, living in a tent, a place that you don't know, having all these hopes and dreams back home. You could just imagine wanting to go back there. But Ezekiel, as he's sitting there outside the Chebar Canal, he's called to be not the priest, but a prophet. And as we go through the first chapter, which we're not going to read through, what you see is him being called to be a prophet in a grand scheme, a grand image. All of a sudden, the glory of the Lord appears to Ezekiel. God on his throne, being carried, it seems, by a chariot of cherubim who are bringing him down and coming to Babylon. And the glory of the Lord's not supposed to be in Babylon. So this is kind of an odd thing for him to be in Babylon, and here's the glory of the Lord coming to him. At the end of chapter 1 it says, such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking. So all that before was as the appearing of the Lord, the glory of the Lord. And I'm not going to tell you all the details of it, don't have time, but I want to encourage you to read that and see what the glory of the Lord would look like as it was revealed to Ezekiel, something that takes a lot of time to describe to you, and I don't have that time. So what we see is the glory of the Lord appears to him, and then in chapter 2, God talks to Ezekiel, and he stands him up on his feet, and he tells him what he's going to be doing. Look at verse 3 of chapter 2. He said to me, Son of man, I send you to the people of Israel, to nations of rebels who have rebelled against me. They and their fathers have transgressed against me to this very day. The descendants also are impotent and stubborn. I send you to them, and you shall say to them, Thus says the Lord God, and whether they hear or refuse to hear, for they are a rebellious house, they will know that a prophet has been among them. And you, son of man, be not afraid of them, nor be afraid of their words, though briars and thorns are with you, and you sit on scorpions. Be not afraid of their words, nor be dismayed at their looks, for they are a rebellious house. And you shall speak my words to them, whether they hear or refuse to hear, for they are a rebellious house. You see, the words of Ezekiel to the exiles are not much different than the words of Jeremiah to those who were in the city. This is a rebellious house, Ezekiel. The people you're talking to are going to be mean and hateful towards you. They're going to be like briars, thorns, scorpions. And so he tells Ezekiel, I'm going to make you, as you go in chapter 3, I'm going to make you hardened like they are hardened. I'm going to make you a stubborn man like they are stubborn. And he's going to give him resilience so that he can stand all the attacks that might come to him. And then after this scene is over, he's brought back to the Chebar canal. And it says in verse 15 that he just sits there overwhelmed for 7 days. You imagine how overwhelmed you would be having seen the glory of the Lord and been given this horrible news that you are one of the prophets now to the rebellious house of Israel. And after the 7 days are over, God comes to Ezekiel again, and he tells him what he's going to do in the land. In chapter 3, verses 24 through 27, we see that he is not going to speak anything to anybody until God says so. And every word that comes out of Ezekiel's mouth will be the words of the Lord. And God says he will be bound to his house and not allowed to leave his house unless the Lord says so. And this is the life of Ezekiel the prophet. For the majority of the time that he's a prophet, he's not allowed to speak of his own, and he's not allowed to go outside of his house. Well, this life is supposed to send a message to the people of the exile. In chapter 2, verse 5, I read that. I want to say it again. They will know that a prophet has been among them. This is just the start of some of the signs that Ezekiel will do. As he is silent and as he is confined, that's just the beginning. And we're going to transition into the next section of the book where it's just full of signs that no human in their right mind would ever think up or do on their own. And it makes it very obvious that he is a prophet of the Lord. There's no doubting it. You know, Jeremiah, everybody's doubting that he's really a prophet of the Lord, and they're pointing to all these false prophets and saying, we like their message better. But nobody's doubting Ezekiel or saying that he's not one of the prophets. Let's start talking about the pictures. The first picture is probably the most startling out of all of them. In chapter 4, we see that Ezekiel was told to take a brick and carve out in the brick Jerusalem. And then he's told to build siege around Jerusalem. You imagine little encampments all around his little brick that's supposed to be Jerusalem. And he's told to set up battering rams against Jerusalem. You just picture a man playing essentially with toys, but he's playing siege, and this is Jerusalem, and this is Ezekiel the prophet. So what's going on? Well, God also tells him, you're going to lay on your left side for 390 days. The period of time that I'm punishing Israel in years. You're going to lay on your side for 390 days. And then he says, at the end of that, you're going to go on your right side, and you're going to lay on that side for 40 days. And the whole time that you're there, with the city besieged, you're going to eat the meal of those inside the city who are besieged. And he tells them it's just going to be this mixture of wheat, barley, beans, lentil, and millet, and emmer. And it's just all these different grains. And it's not Ezekiel bread that you buy in the store. But it's this little wafer that he's going to be eating, and that's going to be his meal throughout the days that he's there. And God tells him, you're going to cook that on your own feces, like you're besieged. And he says, no, I've never done anything unclean. Don't make me do that. And God says, okay, you can use cow feces. How's that sound? That's not good. That doesn't sound fun at all. Well, in chapter 5, he tells him to start the destruction process. And the way that he tells him to destroy the people is take a sword, shave off your head and your beard. And all those little hairs represent the people in the city. And some of the people are going to be set on fire, so you set those hairs on fire. And others of the people are going to be killed by the sword. So you throw them up and you take the sword you shaved your head with and you start swiping at the hairs as they're falling down. And some of the people are going to be carried into captivity. So you take just a few, not very many, and you tie them to the tassels on your robe to carry them off into captivity. This is the picture of the destruction that God is going to give his people. Now you imagine being a captive, an exile, and seeing a man do all of these things. And then he comes in chapter 6 and 7 and he details this is the judgment of God against his people for their rebellion. This is the day of the wrath of the Lord that is going to come upon them. And you can see how people are coming to understand he really is a prophet from the Lord, or he's crazy. But everybody's looking at Ezekiel and everybody's wondering what's going on as over 400 days he's laying siege to his little brick city in his house. In chapter 8, the elders of the city come to him seeking a word from the Lord. You know, Ezekiel don't talk unless it's a word from the Lord. So they're just sitting there waiting for him to speak. And as they're sitting there, God picks Ezekiel up in a vision by the hair, and he takes him to Jerusalem. And he shows him a vision of the state of Jerusalem. He shows them all the idolatry that's going on in the city. And he starts at this outer gate and shows them the image of jealousy, he calls it. This idol that's set up in the city on the outside gate, it seems like. And then he slowly moves closer to the temple. And he on the outside court, there's a wall. And he has Ezekiel dig in a little hole he finds. And he finds inside that hole carved images of different idols that they've been worshiping right outside the temple. And then he takes him to the steps of the temple where you find people bowing down with their backsides to the entrance of the holy place, worshiping the sun. These people have just completely turned against God. And so God calls a man in a linen cloth to go out and find somebody who hasn't bowed down to these idols and put a mark on him. And then he sends his angels in to come in and wipe out the city. You continue through this section, you see a number of other scenes in this vision as God shows his glory departing the temple and moving away from the temple. God is no longer with his people. He has departed from them. His presence is not with them. His protection is not with them. And then chapter 11, we see that he actually kills one of the elders in the city in front of Ezekiel. And Ezekiel says, Lord, will you make a full end of the remnant of Israel? And he's really concerned about this because this man has died. And God comes back and says, I'm going to give my people a new heart. And I'm going to take away the heart of stone, and I'm going to put a new spirit within them. I have plans, he says to Ezekiel, to bless my people. But all that he's seeing is destruction at this time. In chapter 12, Ezekiel comes back at the end of chapter 11 to outside of the Chebar. And he ends up telling the people everything. And then he goes and does another sign in chapter 12. He's told to start packing his bags. You can imagine Ezekiel getting up, starting to pack his bags. He doesn't say anything to anybody, but everybody's like, what are you doing? He's packing up everything he owns that he can carry. And he walks toward the edge of the town that they're at, and he finds a part of the wall, and he starts taking it apart with his hands to make a hole in the wall. And then he climbs out to escape from the city that is besieged. And everybody's like, what are you doing, Ezekiel? We're not besieged. We're in this city. You could have probably walked out the gate. I mean, what are you doing? And God tells him what to tell the people. He says, this is what the prince will do. He will escape from the city like this in the middle of the night, thinking he can get away from the siege, and I will throw my net on him. And Babylon will capture him and destroy him. And so there's lots of signs and pictures in this part of this section that shows that this is God's prophet, as he does all these really bizarre things that God has commanded him to do, and he only speaks when God tells him to. Well, as you continue, we're not going to go into detail of the rest of it. There's a lot there. In chapters 13 through 23, we see a number of sermons or pictures, word pictures for the people to understand the sin of Israel. He talks about Israel being a vine that's useless. He talks about Israel being an unfaithful bride. He talks about Israel being a vine that was taken off the top of a cedar and planted, and it grew and prospered, and then the eagle that planted it ends up seeing another eagle, and it betrays the first eagle and goes after it. And he says, this is like what you've done with Babylon, and you've left Babylon and you've gone to Egypt. So he uses these kinds of pictures to display the sins of Israel and their unfaithfulness, their continual unfaithfulness to the Lord. And as you go through there's just more and more pictures, and then there's a lot of explanation about their sins. And chapter 18 is a critical text in the book, because it will be repeated later, where God explains his justice. He says, if a wicked person, he says, I don't judge the sins of the sons. I don't judge the sons because of the sins of the father. If someone is righteous, he's not going to die. He's righteous. But if he turns from his righteousness and acts wickedly, he will die. And if someone is wicked, he will die, unless he turns from his wickedness and does righteousness, and then he'll live. And he's just explaining very simply his mode of justice. But they say, the Lord is not just. And so God says, this is what the people do. They just act like I'm unjust because of the way that I treat them, because I allow the wicked person a little bit of time to turn it around, and then I bring about judgment. And the righteous person, I allow him a little bit of time to kind of test and see whether his heart's truly righteous. And if he turns against me, then I judge him. And they just look at all that and they judge me as I'm just trying to do what's just and right. And they're the ones who are rebelling against me and refusing to turn away from their wickedness to serve me. So chapter 18 is a really important section of the book. As I said, it will be repeated later. And then we have a lament, and we have a description of the rebellion, and God displays himself as having drawn his sword to go out after the people, and he describes their sins as they have shed innocent blood, and the blood is crying out to the people. In chapter 22. And then chapter 23 again displays the unfaithfulness of Judah, as they are this unfaithful sister who does more sin than Israel did, and they do more sin than all the nations of the earth. It's just overall a picture of their failure and their sin. Chapter 24 is the next section starting. And it tells us at the very beginning, in the 9th year, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, write down the name of this day, the very day. The king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem this very day. This is the beginning of the siege that God has foretold. And so this kind of starts off a new section, explaining that all the things I promised have started to happen on this very day. Ezekiel has the inside track of what's going on in Jerusalem. No messenger has brought it yet, but Ezekiel knows because God has told him. Then Ezekiel's wife dies later on in this chapter. It says in verse 16, Son of man, behold, I'm about to take the delight of your eyes away from you at a stroke. Yet you shall not mourn or weep, nor shall your tears run down. Sigh, but not aloud. Make no mourning for the dead. Bind on your turban and put on your shoes on your feet. Do not cover your lips, nor eat the bread of men. And listen to this. So I spoke to the people in the morning, and at evening my wife died. And on the next morning I did as I was commanded. Another sign is given. In conjunction with the siege that has been laid on Jerusalem, God gives this sign, Ezekiel, I'm taking your wife away. Taking away the delight of your eyes. And you're not going to mourn or cry or weep or wail over her loss. You're going to go about business as usual. And all the people come to him saying, what does all this mean? You said your wife would die and then she died and there was no hint of disease or that she was going to die. And here she is dead. And what does this mean? You're not mourning, you're not weeping. Look what verse 21 says. Say to the house of Israel, thus says the Lord, behold, I will profane my sanctuary, the pride of your power, the delight of your eyes, and the yearning of your soul, and your sons and your daughters, whom you left behind, shall fall by the sword. A picture as God has allowed Ezekiel's delight to die, that all the people's delight is about to be destroyed, and the sanctuary is going to be destroyed. God's sanctuary, his pride, what he desired is to have the relationship with his people. And that has been taken away from him because of the rebellion of the people. The rest of this section, chapter 25 through 31, is all about destruction of nations. Jerusalem has been laid siege, and you'd think there'd be more information about the siege or more information about the sins of Israel, the sins of Judah, but it just tells us about the sins of the nations all around, and that God is going to destroy all of them. He talks about Ammon and Moab and Edom. He talks about Philistia, and then he goes into great detail about Tyre and Egypt. They're given special attention. Like 26 through 28 is all about the region of Tyre. And then 29 all the way through 31 is all about Egypt. Like they're given 3 chapters and 4 chapters. And you just kind of left wondering, why is there so much emphasis given to Tyre? But you remember in our studies how Tyre has played an important role. Remember how they helped Solomon to build the temple. And how Jezebel has come in from Tyre and brought about a lot of corruption and idolatry. And so they had a prominent role in Israel's history, just like Egypt did. And one thing that you see in these sections is that these nations were beautiful and powerful because God had made them into nations that were like Eden, that were prosperous and growing and thriving. But they became proud. They thought much of themselves, and they thought themselves to be gods because of all that they've accomplished. And they didn't understand or recognize that God had done all that. So God calls them out for it, and he promises them destruction. And then we get into chapter 33, and we see, finally, Jerusalem is destroyed. But before we get to Jerusalem being destroyed in chapter 33, he brings up the fact that he has made Ezekiel Israel's watchman. Now, this is something he said back in the call, back in chapter 3, and I forgot to mention it. Ezekiel is this watchman on the watchtower who sees the enemy coming, and he's supposed to warn everybody about the enemy that's coming. And God told him at the beginning of his call, if you don't warn the people, their blood will be on your own head. Well, he repeats that again in chapter 33. And then he repeats again what we saw in chapter 18. Those who turn from righteousness to do wickedness will die, and those who turn from wickedness to do righteousness will be saved. But one thing he says in that is found in verse 11. He says, say to them, as I live, declares the Lord, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live. Turn back from your evil ways. For why will you die, O house of Israel? You see a statement of God being reluctant, not wanting to do what he has to do, but doing it because the people refuse to listen. In verse 21, we read about a fugitive coming from Jerusalem and telling everybody that the city has been struck down. And at that time, Ezekiel's mouth is finally opened. He spent all that time not speaking to anybody except what God had told him. And this is a sign of hope that's about to come. Throughout the rest of the book, that's exactly what we see. We see a message of hope. In chapters 34 all the way through 48, after all that devastating news, and after finally finding out that that city that they had been hoping to return to has been destroyed, God allows his prophet to speak freely, and then he gives him messages of hope. I want to go through the pictures of hope that are found in this section. There's a ton of them, and I'm not going to be able to tell you all of them, but I want to give you the big picture idea that's found in each chapter very briefly, and let you do more detailed studies for yourself. There's 10 pictures I want to look at. So first of all, he tells the people that he will give them new shepherds. Those evil shepherds he'll remove, and he'll replace them with good shepherds that allow his sheep to feed and find rest. Then he tells them in chapter 35 he's going to be dealing with all of their enemies, and he portrays the enemy as Edom, right? Esau versus Jacob. So they're the enemy, and he says, I'm going to take care of them, and I'm going to remove the shame that they have put on you. Then he says, I'm going to restore your land. The land has suffered greatly because of the sins of the people. There's been famine. There's been all kinds of destruction and stuff that's gone on in the land. And so he says, I'm going to make it a fruitful place again. And I'm going to bring about multiplication. You're going to grow and prosper in this land because the land's going to be plentiful like the Garden of Eden once again. Then he says in 36 also, he's going to restore his name that they had shamed. And then he says, I'm going to restore your hearts. I'm going to give you a new heart. I'm going to sprinkle clean your heart. And I'm going to give you a new spirit. And then he says, I will restore your prosperity. I'll let the house of Israel ask me to do this for them, to increase their people like a flock, like the flock for sacrifices. He says, I'm going to bring about this multiplication of your people, and prosperity will follow. Then chapter 37 gives us a picture of the dry bones. Remember, the valley of dry bones is here in Ezekiel 37, where he looks out and he sees all these dry bones of dead people. And he asks Ezekiel, can these bones live? And Ezekiel says, you know, Lord. And then he says, speak to them. Prophesy to the bones. And he did. And the bones end up coming to life. And they end up growing with muscle and sinew. And then God says, prophesy to the breath. And they're full of breath. And it becomes this great army to serve the Lord. And so God is able to restore the life of Israel that was once dead. He's able to bring Israel back to life. And then in chapters 38 and 39, we read about the nations, the multitude of nations rising up against God's people again. Gog and of Magog coming in to destroy the people. And God shows everybody that he instead will destroy them. He will not allow them to destroy his people. It tells us that the restoration is not going to bring about perfect peace, that nobody wants to kill us, but it will be perfect peace because God will fight for his people and destroy their enemies. And then we get to chapters 40 through 48. And if you go through these chapters, you're going to be like, what in the world is all of this? As he describes the new Jerusalem and the new temple. And he gives all kinds of measurements and all kinds of design descriptions of this new Jerusalem and this new temple and what life will be like in the Jerusalem of God. And in the midst of that, we see that God's glory will return. And he will once again dwell with his people. He will be their God, and they will be his people. The ultimate blessing that God has been calling for all along. Okay, so that is the book of Ezekiel in all. The very last verse of the book is implying the very thing that I said. It says, the name of the city from that time on shall be, the Lord is there. I like to look at the end of the book and see that final statement, that final punchline. So what is this whole book about? What's the message of the book? Well, if you're an exile in Babylon, how important is this book? How needed is this book? You know, you're probably surrounded by Babylonians who are saying, our God is better than your God. Look, we've defeated your city. There's no hope for you guys. Why would you ever worship Yahweh? Why don't you just come on over and worship the way we worship? Why don't you just live the way we live? And if God had never given them a book describing that He was the one behind the destruction and that He had promised future restoration, they would just leave God. Like, why would they stick around? But this book reveals that God was the one who orchestrated the destruction of Jerusalem, and that God has plans for the future. He can see the future, and He can bring about what He wants in the future. So they all must turn away from their wickedness to righteousness and seek after the Lord. A phrase that's used throughout this book is the phrase, then they will know that I am the Lord. If you start counting it, you will lose count because it's in there so many times. Seems like every time he mentions that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, he always says, then they will know that I am the Lord. This whole book is trying to give the people the impression that God is in control of everything. He is the one bringing all of this about. And as they might think that there's no way anybody could ever destroy Jerusalem, here is God saying, I will. I will destroy my own city. And so all of this is intended to strengthen their faith in Him. It doesn't seem like good news as you read about the destruction of Jerusalem, but if they know that God is in control because of this, and if they truly put their trust and their faith in Him as a result of this, then it works out for the good. And those who are exiles have actually been saved from the judgment. And so that completely changes their understanding of all that has taken place. So if we're going to apply this, the obvious application is that we need to understand that God is in control of everything. He is over all, and He has a plan in mind that He can bring about. And that He has done it in the past as He destroys Jerusalem back in 586, and He did it again in 70 A.D. as He told He was going to by the prophet Daniel and also by Jesus Himself. So we know He's in control and that He despises nations that are powerful and that put all their trust in themselves, and that He will destroy them. He does it with Jerusalem. He does it with Ammon. He does it with Moab. He does it with Edom. He does it with Philistia. He really focuses on it with Tyre. He really focuses on it again with Egypt. And this is the way God handles the kingdoms of earth. And we'll see this idea again repeated in the book of Daniel. We know in all of this that God's exiles are those who will be delivered and who will be provided new life. Those who are living in a country that they don't feel at home in will find a home in God's country, in God's new Jerusalem, and they will live eternally in His presence. So how should we respond? As we live here on earth, we should consider ourselves exiles who are struggling because we're not where we're supposed to be, but who are putting our faith fully in God, turning away from our wickedness, and trying to strive after the righteousness that God has called us to live by. In Romans 12, we read, "Vengeance is mine, says the Lord, and I will repay." And that's exactly what we must trust in, that all the nations that might come against us will be repaid for their evil, and that we can trust in the promises of God to be rescued and to be brought safely into an eternal home, because we are the chosen people of God. So while we're here, we love others, we honor them, we honor the government, we honor everybody and show love and seek after righteousness, trusting in the ultimate promises of God. And that's the message of Ezekiel as quickly as I can give it. I hope that helps you as you study the book. This is definitely a book that's worth your time and your study. I hope to go through it in more detail after the book of Jeremiah, but hopefully it helps you. If there's anybody here this evening that has not put on Christ and received the blessings that he offers, we want to encourage you and help you in any way we can. If you have any needs in any way and we can help you, please come as we stand and as we sing.